Okay, hello again. A warm welcome from my side to everybody who has joined us here via Zoom and on YouTube, of course. My name is Jessica and I'm the president of Women in International Security Austria. And we're an organization here in Vienna for everybody who's joining us from abroad. And we're an organization completely run by volunteers with a mission to create an international platform for women and men to work side by side towards equitable peace and security by hosting policy debates such as the one that we're having today. We're trying to create a network of young professionals in Vienna, and most importantly, we're trying to give a voice to female security experts. And that's really also what we're doing today. I have a couple of, I'm going to be leading through this day today, and I'm going to start with a number of technical modalities that we will have to follow so this conference can be as smooth as possible. You have all been sent a program. It is probably helpful if you're going to join us for the entire day if you have your program open and ready, because it has important notes and links in there. If you do have any questions or any problems, we have set up a help desk. We have people watching our chat all day long, so if you have questions, you can post in the chat. We have also set up a Facebook forum, which you can find the link for also in the chat now or in your program manual. In that Facebook forum, you can ask questions, you can share some views, you can comment on what is happening on the panel right now. Because obviously an online conference is very difficult to have this whole human interaction that you would usually have, and that is really what we're trying to bridge with the Facebook forum. So go join the forum, and should you have any other questions, for example, that cannot be resolved in the chat, you can also send us an email at wiisaustria@wiisglobal.org. A couple of other rules that we set up today to have to see who all is there. We would like to ask you to name yourself, to name your video, and if you're joining from an organization or institution, to add that institution so we can see who all is here. If you'd like, you could also upload a picture so we're not all staring at empty screens. And that is also leading me to my next thing. We'd really like to ask you to keep yourself muted and your video off so the streaming quality can stay good throughout and we're not overloading the program. We are filming this conference. As I mentioned, it's live streaming on YouTube and people are joining via that stream. So if you do not want to be a part of this live stream video, again, do not turn on your video or your microphone. And yeah, I think that is it. I think last hello to the people on YouTube, I've already mentioned it. If you would like to join the conversation via YouTube, we're also monitoring the comment section on YouTube. So if you're commenting or asking questions there, we will also be able to feed this into the program. Now on to the interesting part. Our first speaker today is Angela Kane. She's joining us as the vice president of one of our partner institutions today, the International Institute for Peace. But she also has a number of other functions. I'm just gonna tell you a few of them because she's a visiting professor at Sciences Po, but also the Tsinghua University in Beijing. She's a senior fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And before holding all of these positions, she was actually the United Nations High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. And before going into that position, she held a number of other positions in the United Nations, where she supported several special political missions, such as in Iraq, in Nepal, in the Middle East, and she established the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. So I think she's bringing a lot to the table today, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Thank you for being here, Angela, and you may unmute yourself now.
I did. Thank you very much, Jessica, for this generous introduction. And I'm really very happy that the IIP is partnering with you. We've partnered with you before. And I'm also very pleased to be here with all of you because I want to make some introductory remarks about the issue of women. And having worked at the UN for 35 years, you can imagine that being a woman, and particularly a professional woman in the UN, was not that easy. And I find it very interesting when you look at it, because really history has been dominated by powerful men, because power and the male gender were somehow always the same. And the occasional strong woman was really memorable because she was so unusual in a world that was dominated by men. The charter, the UN Charter, was really the first instrument ever to inscribe the equal rights of men and women as part of fundamental human rights. And there was recent research that was done, and it was fascinating when I discovered that, because it showed that 3 women delegates participated in the San Francisco conference that adopted the UN Charter in 1945, and they were all from Latin American countries. There was one from Brazil, one from the Dominican Republic, and one from Uruguay, and their leader was Berta Lutz from Brazil, and she basically demanded an explicit reference to women's rights in the Charter. And I thought it was fascinating that this idea was not something at the 1945 conference, which came from the West. And in fact, not only was the West opposed to have gender equality in the agenda, but they also tried to remove it from Article 8 in the UN Charter, which says that women and men can participate equally in all UN bodies. And she wrote a memoir, and in that memoir, she said that the UK, for example, told her, and the US, not to ask for anything for women in the Charter, since that would be a very vulgar thing to do. I think it's a wonderful quote, even though it's 75 years ago, but it still resonates with those of us who have always been fighting for equal rights for women. And Lutz and the other 2 women persisted, and we now have several references to the equality of women and men in the Charter, as well as a reference to non-discrimination on the basis of sex. And again, this was very forward-looking at the time that the Charter was drafted, and it's a very, very strong legacy. And even today, I think women taking leadership roles in diplomacy remains a bit of an unpopular concept among diplomats in many parts of the world. And if we look at the statistics, you can see that out of 193 countries, you have only 22 heads of state who are women, and 11 of these countries are here in Europe. Many countries have never had a woman as a head of state, and only 4 countries in the world have at least 50% women in the national legislature. And worldwide, the proportion of women in national parliaments is only 24%. So there really is a really long way to go. And according to a Catalyst.org, the Fortune 500 companies, only 6% of CEOs are women. And that's a 1-point increase in 5 years. And 26% were senior corporate managers, an increase of 2% since 2015. So you really see that there's a huge amount that still needs to be done in this field for women to get higher up in the hierarchy, so to say. But I want to talk a little bit about Resolution 1325. And as you know, it had a long history of gestation. It was adopted in 2000, 25 years ago. And this was after the first conference, World Conference on Women, was held in Mexico. There had been 3 subsequent conferences that followed. And so basically, one important step that was taken was also the declaration of March 8th as the International Women's Day. And that really allowed women, that included now women at the UN also, to use this occasion for advocacy and for campaigning for equal rights and an increase in senior level appointments for women. The General Assembly, after the adoption of Resolution 25 and those conferences in particular, always called for a higher percentage of women in UN management and senior positions. But the statistic is very, very different, because at the end of the 1990s, only 7.1% of positions at the D1 level and higher were held by women. That's a very sobering statistic. In 2000, when the resolution was adopted, no woman was seated at the Security Council table, and the number of women ambassadors was in the single digits. But Resolution 1325, which, as you know, was adopted by the Security Council, was a very strong recognition that women were crucial to peace processes and international security. Though I must stress that again, at the time, the initial focus was more on women as victims of underdevelopment. But they regularly monitored, the Council regularly monitored the implementation. There was a long report that was done. I think that when you look at the positive side, Resolution 1325 was really a watershed for the international community, because it placed the question of women and gender very clearly at the top of the agenda and made it part of the formal UN discourse on security. And it has now become a central part of the agenda, not only on the political part, but in addition to the humanitarian and development context. It's really a topic that cannot be shunned. I think that what we really need to look at, and I'm very happy that this conference in particular focuses on this, that we shouldn't always look at women through the development lens, but we should look at it through the political lens, and we shouldn't look at it in the women as victims lens. And this has been the traditional approach to gender that we have seen. And I think that when you look at particularly women in international security, women have long been excluded from arms control, the military, also diplomacy, as I mentioned. And there was a recent resolution, and I'm just mentioning this very briefly because I found it important, that was adopted by the Security Council on women and peacekeeping. And while it wasn't a WPS, a Women, Peace and Security resolution in the strictest sense, it was a really very important nuance as a discussion of women as actors. And previously calls to, let's say, women's participation in peacekeeping relied on gendered stereotypes. It relied on soft skills and their role as protectors of women, girls, and children. And such a stereotypical language for the first time was missing from this resolution that was adopted just a few weeks ago, and instead stresses their operational effectiveness. A subtle, but it's a very, very meaningful change, and we need to pay attention to that. And the other important change is that 97 countries co-sponsored this resolution, including all 15 Security Council members. Now, looking to the future, and that is my last point, is a lot has happened in the last 20 years on the 1325 agenda. It's easy to be critical, but what is really important is to look forward to it. And what I find interesting is that ahead of the 20th anniversary, which, as you know, is always looked at in October, there is the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security, which is an umbrella organization of 18 organizations of international NGOs advocating for equal and meaningful participation of women in international peace and security. And what they did is they elaborated a roadmap with recommendations for the implementation of the WPS agenda. It's very ambitious, it's very far-reaching, and I don't think it will, in its totality, be adopted by the Security Council. But it really is important that these ideas are coming up, that they are being put forward, that they are being given to member states and to say, here is something that you really need to do. And I think that is very important, that the norm and the expectations of the Women, Peace and Security agenda are a fact, that it really is happening. Let me stop here and turn it back to you, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. If you participants are interested in learning more about Angela's work and the work of the International Institute for Peace, I'd highly encourage you to visit their website, where you can see the many, many events that they organize, and it's very interesting. Thank you again for being here. And now I'd like to move on to our keynote speech. It is going to be on the gender and disarmament nexus that we're sort of trying to talk about today. Here to speak about this is Laura Rockwood, and I will say that we at WIIS Austria have been talking about having some sort of disarmament event and having Laura Rockwood for years now. I want to say almost since we started working more closely in 2017. So we're really quite happy you're here. She's here now in a very new position. Since recently, you are the director of the Open Nuclear Network, which is a program of One Earth Future. Laura has over 30 years of experience in non-proliferation and international safeguards, and was awarded with the Distinguished Service Award by the Institute of Nuclear Materials Management. She has previously worked for the International Atomic Energy Agency, where she was the section head for non-proliferation and policy in the Office of Legal Affairs. And after she left the agency, she went to the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. We heard about this earlier because Angela is a senior fellow there. And she led that between 2015 and 2019, and then went to the Open Nuclear Network. And I'd like to now hand over to Laura. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here. I was very struck by Angela's comment about the history of 1325 having focused on women as victims. And I recall that the WPS pillars are participation, prevention, protection, and relief recovery. So I'm going to focus on participation, especially through the lens of nuclear diplomacy. However, I will conclude with an intervention with a short video that touches on all four of these pillars. So here's a question. How many of you, when you saw the agenda item, Gender and Disarmament Nexus, actually asked yourself, what is the Nexus? I can tell you I was one of them, and I've been looking into this. In 2019, UNODA conducted a study on gender balance in arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament policy. The study included the convening of focus groups in Geneva, New York, and Vienna of diplomats, staff of the international organizations, and representatives of civil society and academia. Again, I was one of them. The results of the study are published in UNODA's report, Still Behind the Curve. If I can show you. And I have to admit, I've cribbed liberally from this report. I just hope I fairly represented their results. Let's talk about the numbers. UNODA notes that while there really has been a steady increase over the past 4 decades in the proportion of women in disarmament diplomacy, we are still very much underrepresented. Some of the numbers. On average, women comprise only 1/3 of the diplomats in arms control and disarmament forums. Second, there's a strong correlation between the group size and gender balance. In smaller, more specialized forums, the average proportion of women drops to 20%. The proportion of women further declines as the importance of the position increases. And I found these numbers instructive. Among the diplomatic community in New York, 37% are women. Among the UN ambassadors in New York, 24% of women. Among the foreign ministers around the world, 12%. And finally, heads of state or government, less than 6%. So in addition, the proportion of the heads of delegation is always higher than the overall proportion of men delegates, while the opposite is the case for women delegates. Interestingly enough, and I think Angela foresaw this in her comments about the UN Charter, gender distribution varies across regional groups with, interestingly enough, still to this day, Latin America and the Caribbean leading in gender equality, with Asia Pacific and Africa almost tied for last place. And there's another factor that comes into play, and that has to do with the wealth of the state. High-income states tend to have a slightly more gender balanced representation than low-income states. So here you have the tie-in between diplomacy and development. So let's focus on the question of representation of women in disarmament diplomacy as compared with other subjects. UNODA, in conjunction with the International Law and Policy Institute, produced a joint study in 2016 in which it was an extensive study on gender as related to disarmament and arms control. In their study, they concluded that men continued to be heavily overrepresented and women underrepresented in multilateral forums concerned with security issues, including those related to nuclear weapons. And it is a pattern that held true across all the UN regional groups. No surprise there. Men's overrepresentation and women's underrepresentation seem to be even more pronounced in forums that are concerned with security issues and disarmament than in others, such as aid, labor issues, climate change. For example, comparing the gender distribution of the first committee, the UN General Assembly First Committee in 2017 the first committee deals with security issues. It had 32.4% participation by women. The third committee on humanitarian issues soars up to 48.9%, a huge difference in the percentage of women's representation in those committees. So what is this issue, soft versus hard portfolios? Well, some have suggested that arms control and disarmament, by virtue of their nature, tend to reward characteristics, expertise, and experience that are more commonly associated with men: toughness, seriousness, risk-taking, and military planning. But it's also complicated by gendered binary hierarchies and division of labor. What do societies expect of women in the context of a family as opposed to men? How many organizations don't hire women or mothers? And there are the gendered choices. Would a woman choose not to travel to countries in conflict because she's a mother or because she's a woman? Or are women not given or don't take foreign assignments, either alone or with their families where that's even possible? But I get back to this issue of why is gender equality important in the context of disarmament? What really is the nexus? Do women necessarily make a difference in terms of positive outcomes in the context of disarmament? Some people, like me, would like to see a stronger case for including women's voice in disarmament diplomacy. As I said to the Vienna focus group during the study a year or so ago, I personally am skeptical about arguments that women are more peaceful than men. I find this stereotypes female perspectives developed within socially constructed characteristics of what's masculine and what's feminine. It simply perpetuates stereotypes and preconceptions. It keeps us in boxes, and we don't belong there. But there are some studies, such as the 2016 study to which I just referred, in which they offer evidence of the positive impact of women's inclusion on the durability of disarmament agreements. Granted, those are mostly in the context of conflict and post-conflict peace processes. The study did note that the male-female representation and femininity-masculinity discourse are really two distinct issues, which, although linked, it's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation. The relationship between gender balance and the degree to which nuclear weapons are seen as legitimate instruments of statecraft is not easily determined. Now, while there may be a legitimate debate about whether more equal representation by women would have a positive impact on nuclear weapons discourse, there is clear evidence that the exclusion of women inhibits the range of perspective brought to bear on collective problems, perspectives that might not otherwise be placed on the table. And of course, there is the fundamental argument of fairness and equality. We have a right to full and fair representation, as women comprise almost 50% of the world's population, with a slight majority of women in many countries. In spite of international agreement on the importance of women's participation in decision-making, there is still a marked gender imbalance in multilateral disarmament forums. Failure to apply a gender perspective and a lack of female participation may be factors contributing to the current lack of nuclear disarmament progress. As John Barry and his colleagues concluded in the 2016 study, discourse is not just about what people say, it's also about who speaks in the first place. Numbers aren't everything, it's voices heard. Secretary General's 2018 Agenda for Disarmament prioritizes efforts to address the gender imbalance in arms control and disarmament diplomacy forums, referring to it as, and I quote, a moral duty and an operational necessity. The agenda reiterates the need for full and equal participation of women in all decision-making processes related to disarmament and international security, with the goal of enabling free and equal participation regardless of gender or other social marker as a means of bringing together arms control and disarmament and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. My own organization, Open Nuclear Network, is a gender champion in nuclear policy, and I myself am an international gender champion. In that context and from that perspective, I've focused on the pillar of participation, particularly in the nuclear context. But if you'll allow me, I'd like to finish with a short video produced by ONN's sister program, Our Secure Future, on the broader nexus between gender and disarmament. So if you will bear with me, I will attempt to share my screen and the video. Okay, where are you? Here we go. Share. Let's get started. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. You would have seen my colleague Sahana in there. I found myself almost drawn to tears watching this again. It's so impactful and so powerful. So thank you for the opportunity to share that with you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak about something that is very important to all of us.
Thank you, Laura, again for being here. I find it almost a bit sad usually at these panels when people are speaking, you would hear the applause afterwards and some sort of feedback that we heard you, but we heard you and it was really interesting. I especially like the points that you raised about not using these instruments that we have to perpetuate stereotypes that we are hearing all the time. You know, women are more peaceful. That's why they need to be included in the peace process. We got a couple of comments that you couldn't hear the audio so well. So we have shared the link to the video in the chat, and everybody who wants to go back and watch the video, you can do that via the link that we just posted. And for now, thank you again, Laura, for joining. And we're gonna move along in the program and come to a second keynote, where we're going to talk a little bit. So now we've talked about the resolution 1325, and we have talked about the nexus to disarmament. And now we actually want to take a closer look at disarmament issues and disarmament in the next decades. You know, what challenges do we have? Which opportunities do we see? And here to speak about this, we have probably the expert for it in Vienna, the head of the Vienna office for Disarmament Affairs, Valere Mantels. Before joining the Vienna office, Valere Mantels was actually with the UN in Geneva and in New York, but I also read that he trained as a professional F-16 pilot fighter with Belgian Air Force. So definitely a lot of different experiences here to draw from. Yeah, so I'd like to hand over to you now, Valere, to speak about disarmament in the next decade.
Thank you, Jessica. I hope you can hear me. All right, here we go. As a speaker, I feel I'm in extremely good company. I'm actually a little bit humbled by the previous speakers, Anna-Katharina and Laura, whom I know very well, and I respect their expertise and insights. And I agree with everything they have said. Nevertheless, as you said, Jessica, I'm going to divert a little bit from the gender perspectives and focus on substantive disarmament issues. But I would like to thank you for inviting me to speak here today. Challenges and opportunities for disarmament in the next decade, which is around the corner. Challenges, don't want to be all doom and gloom, and I'll keep this rather short. But the most obvious challenge at this moment and for the considered time to be is COVID-19. There is no doubt about that. COVID-19 is the greatest challenge the world has faced in the 75 years of the UN's existence. It has added a layer of uncertainty to an already unpredictable global environment with fragile and tense relationships between great powers. And it is obvious that the pandemic has exacerbated relations between some nuclear armed states. And that reminds me, I shouldn't put words in my statement that I can't pronounce. So exacerbated is basically worsened. That's something I can pronounce.
Exacerbate.
While the COVID-19 pandemic has been hugely disruptive and devastating for many, we must bear in mind that the nuclear weapon detonation would be significantly more destructive, and no state on the planet is prepared to respond adequately. And this reality compels us to redouble our efforts to eliminate this potentially existential threat once and for all. The pandemic, along with the economic shocks it is creating, has also triggered renewed reflection on the implications of unconstrained military spending. Only a handful of states have made commitments to reduce military spending in favor of fighting COVID-19. A lot of states have recently decided to proceed with major arms deals for both financial and political purposes. Arms deals that absorb indispensable resources for human security and development, but they also contribute to regional instability and tensions. The pandemic has also renewed the concerns about the threat posed by biological weapons. particularly their use by non-state actors. It has led to a heightened interest in the BWC, the Biological Weapons Convention, in Security Council Resolution 1540, which mandate is due to expire in April next year, so we're looking at renewal of the mandate. When we talk about non-state actors' use of biotech, there are a number of tools on the market available to all that bring development of malignant agents within reach of about everybody. Another issue that I'd like to highlight is the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. The Secretary General has published a report just a while ago, and he states that the pandemic has potential to devastate conflict-affected states and overwhelm already weak healthcare systems, worsening the vulnerability of the least protected in society. And this leads me to the Secretary General's agenda for disarmament, close to our heart, although not endorsed by the General Assembly. It is his agenda, but it does lay out 4 key pillars that are as relevant now as ever to achieve peace and security through disarmament. And rather than expanding on these pillars and bore you to death by talking, I invite you to watch a short video that my office has prepared and which I will share with you.
When you are sharing the video, make sure you click the little button that says Enhance Video.
Enhance video. Why are you doing this to me? All right. Does it work, Jessica?
Perfect.
All right, so I'm back. I hope I'm good again. All right, this brings me to the opportunities, which is a bit larger than my challenges part. We see a lot of fiscal pressure created by the pandemic, and the need for a quick, although that is very relative, for a recovery, I would say, opens a window of opportunity for national security strategies based more on dialogue, arms control, and disarmament. COVID-19 has raised the awareness of the impact which diseases can have and the need to urgently improve global health security. And a part of the effort should focus on addressing the possibility of the deliberate use of a disease as a weapon. This heightened attention to the threat of bioagents presents really an opportunity to make progress on the universalization and enhancing the implementation of the WWC, including at the 9th Review Conference next year in November. And the enhanced efforts, I feel, should also include a focus on assistance, response, preparedness, including through international cooperation, which is so lacking at this moment. The world is rightly alarmed by the growing antagonism between nuclear armed states, by the return of concepts of nuclear war fighting, the race to improve nuclear weapons, but also by the nexus, and this is new, the nexus between nuclear weapons and other domains, such as cyber and outer space. We absolutely need risk reduction measures to reduce the prospects of a deliberate or accidental use or miscalculation. But finally, the only way to eliminate the nuclear risk is to eliminate nuclear weapons. So therefore, we are definitely looking forward to the remaining few ratifications needed for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons to enter into force. The Secretary General has underscored that when the treaty enters into force, it will become an important part of the international disarmament regime and complement other avenues such as the NPT. And this is a wish not only by myself, but from a limited amount of people. 24 October would be very symbolic for reaching 50 ratifications, as this day marks the anniversary of the entry into force in 1945 of the UN Charter. 24 October this year is Saturday. We'll see how far we get. Let's keep the hopes up. And we cannot stress enough the role of civil society organizations. Thank you, Beatrice and colleagues, whose dedication continues to contribute enormously. We are also eagerly anticipating the next NPT review conference, which hopefully will lay the ground for a push to help reverse current trends. The conference should strengthen the implementation of all three of the NPT's pillars, including through the actualization of previously agreed commitments. Then we're back to military expenditure. I think we need to reflect on the link between the ongoing, quite excessive military expenditures and our ability to respond to global shocks, like the COVID-19 pandemic. A couple words on gender equality, but I think that has been beaten to death by both Angela and Laura. It is not only a moral imperative and a fundamental human right, but it is a powerful tool for progress in peace and disarmament. And the Secretary General's agenda includes a number of actions on ensuring full and equal participation of women in all decision-making processes related to disarmament and international security. Nevertheless, women remain chronically underrepresented, not the least in decision-making and leadership. However, a word of caution, we must move beyond just numbers. Equal representation will mean little unless there is an enabling environment where participation is truly meaningful. The continued relevance of multilateralism also depends on how we create space for young people to fully participate. It is crucial for developing new and innovative strategies to reduce threats to peace and security. And here, Jessica, I think your outfit is perfectly placed. It is focused on youth, it is focused on female participants, and that is the way to go. UNODA, the Office for Disarmament Affairs, itself is engaging, it is educating, it is empowering young people through an outreach initiative, which is called Youth for Disarmament, under which a number of resources are now made available. New technologies, as you saw in the video, we're making massive leaps ahead, and the development of new technologies has not been slowed down by the pandemic. But there are no regulations, there are no limits on how to work with these new technologies. And although a number of these technologies are definitely used for peaceful applications, they can also be suitable for warfighting activities. So we need to find ways to keep ahead of the implications posed by emerging weapon technologies. And I feel at this moment has never been more urgent in light of the massive progress that we're making. In July, the Secretary General has issued a report on the current developments in science and technology and their potential impact on the international security and disarmament efforts. It is a very impressive document. I highly recommend to consult it, to read it, and try to understand what he is saying. But the bottom line is we need regulations. Outer space. It remains important that outer space does not become a domain of active hostilities and the setting for a new arms race. Therefore, we are encouraged by the active development and discussion of new proposals on seeking norms of responsible behavior in space. There is a renewed multilateral interest in missile controls, and basically there are no legally binding instruments to control those devices. The only thing we have is a MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime, which is basically a gentleman's agreement, and there is the Hague Code of Conduct, which is also a voluntary agreement. But missiles, the development of missiles at the moment is really boosted by technological developments. It only suffices to point at hypersonic vehicles, which we feel will be highly destabilizing in the security environment and urgently need to be addressed. I'd like to mention the Missile Dialogue Initiative by the German government. It is really a welcome effort to look at ideas to take forward this work. The time really has come for renewed, substantive multilateral efforts on the difficult issues associated with missiles of various types. Austria has been hosting the first conference on the issue of explosive weapons in populated areas. And we are really looking forward to the consultations led by Ireland to develop a political commitment on the issue. The use of these weapons disrupts, destroys the essential infrastructure that conflict-affected societies desperately require to contain the pandemic. Finally, and here we're getting closer to what my office is doing, COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to think away from the traditional ways to conduct meetings, conferences, but also training. This conference is case in point, or is it point in case? I always confuse. This conference is a case in point, I think, of the former. But the COVID-19 crisis underscores the value and effectiveness of distance learning. The Vienna office, my office at the moment, of UNODA, is exploring how we can strategize with various partners to further improve and promote learning in the virtual space. The Vienna office has developed an online resources platform with education materials to include courses on a wide range of disarmament, non-proliferation, arms control issues, as well as cross-cutting issues, including gender issues related to disarmament, non-proliferation. And I invite you to visit the website that hosts the platform. It's called disarmamenteducation.org. and feel free to take a couple courses, see what they look like. Don't hesitate to get in touch with us and provide feedback on whether we're on the right track or we're simply losing our time. With that, Jessica, I have completed my overview of what is bothering us and how we can remedy the situation. But as said, it needs a lot of political will, and it needs a different vision away from arms and for nuclear deterrence to a more inclusive platform that allows us to deliberate on a different basis on these issues. And I thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you very much. I thought that was very helpful as an introduction to a conference that we will be dealing with these issues. I'm going to use some of the things that you mentioned, which I thought was very interesting because they were, I mean, of course, you talked about the NPT pillars and also the various technological advancements, especially the hypersonic vehicles, which I hadn't even heard about before. Very interesting. But I also thought that there was very soft issues that were, especially in your video, where you were like, you know, it's also about international cooperation. It's about empowering the next generation. How do we effectively involve young people and women? And I think this is actually a good leads me over into the next part of our conference. And at this point, I'd like to say thank you to Valere, Angela, and Laura for joining us. And big round of applause virtually, I guess. But yeah, thank you for joining us. And next on our agenda, we have the lightning talks. And the lightning talks were an idea that we had to exactly include sort of empowering young women and giving them a stage to speak about their thing, their topics. And so at this point, I would like to invite Miriam and Anna to turn on their videos and in a moment also their microphones. I'm gonna, yeah, here's Miriam, hello. And here's also, do I see Anna? Yeah, Anna's also here. Excellent. Okay, so our next point is going to be the lightning talks. I mentioned this. These are 10-minute talks where our young researchers are going to present what they are working on to bring us to the forefront of what science has to offer in this field at the moment. And our first talk is going to be by Miriam. She's going to talk about the regional governments of the WPS agenda in, for, or by the Global South, which is really interesting, I think. Miriam identifies herself as an Afro-German. She's German, but with a Ugandan heritage, and she's based in Bonn, in Germany. At the moment, she's working as a PhD researcher at the Heinrich-Heine University, but also as a strategic policy and research advisor for the fabulous Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, which probably everybody here is a huge fan of. Most recently, she's published together with Dr. Tony Harstrup, a piece on the protection of human rights defenders. And at the moment, Miriam is co-authoring with Nassim Saheli and Nora Tuma a publication on the implementation of the WPS agenda in Germany for UN Women Germany. And yeah, without further ado, Miriam, I'd like to ask you to unmute yourself and give us your talk.
Thank you, Jessica, for the brief introduction. Thank you so much also for giving me the opportunity to being here today. So yeah, why I'm looking at WPS governments for, in, or by the Global South. As you mentioned, I'm part of a research project, and there we are mainly looking at the African Union, League of Arab States, and the ASEAN. And because of that, I was wondering, okay, all these governance structures, are they actually just in the Global South, or even like for and established by the Global South? And the other angle I want to point out is that I'm interested in the topic, especially WPS, because I work at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, especially on WPS issues, but also trying to foster a more decolonial approach in the feminist foreign policy strategies themselves, but also in the WPS agenda. And how I ended up looking at the WPS agenda is that, as you mentioned, I worked for Young Women. I also worked for Young Women Germany, and there I dealt with the implementation mainly of the WPS agenda in Germany. And then I looked into the history, and I also really liked the inputs before me, because they kind of also covered the history of 1325. And I looked into that, and then I was thinking, okay, so this is such a great framework, such a good human rights instrument, and it's mainly like it is rooted really in the global South, and especially from global South, women being affected by armed conflicts. So looking or finding out this particular and very important aspect, I was wondering whether those roots are still shaping the discourse on feminism in general, but also on feminism in peace and security, and therefore in the governance of the WPS agenda. And as for myself, I understand like institutions, but also armed conflicts as gendered systems. So everything is gender. There's no space where you can't find power hierarchies based on gender. And so this is how everything comes together. And then I was particularly looking at the moment, I'm in particular looking at the African Union and how the African Union actually governs the WPS agenda, understands feminism and women's empowerment, and also how the African Union understands peace and security strategies. And bringing all this together, I found the Women Mediators Network of the African Union called WIIS, which is a great example of how the WPS governance in the Global South is working by and for the Global South. Mainly WIIS concentrates on participation, but it also covers the other pillars of the WPS agenda. And another really interesting example is how the African Union is reclaiming agency through a campaign that's called Silencing the Guns. And this campaign, and also the theme of this year of the African Union, is really concentrating on disarmament. And as the African Union has committed itself to see gender as a cross-cutting issue, the WPS agenda and the policies of the African Union are linked to the Silencing the Gun campaign. So these are really two good examples how WPS governments can work in, for, and by the Global South, Silencing the Guns and WIIS. And I mean, of course, it's not just like this discussion is not just happening in the institutions themselves, but also it's happening in the academic discourse and over decades actually, but a post-colonial perspective on WPS agenda is still then quite new, although there are brilliant academics and who have been talking about it since like decades, but they weren't labeled as feminist academics or in peace and security. And two, I like to point out are first Swati Parashar, and I really like her expression when she talks about decolonizing the WPS agenda, where she's saying, in the beginning, it was like saving women, now it's like saving feminism. So she says, like, from saving women to saving feminism, there's a shift in the discourse, especially how global North actors who are dominant in now governing the WPS agenda are understanding the WPS agenda. And this is linked to the fact that there's a dominant understanding that in the global north, the knowledge production, the policy designing and policy making concerning WPS agenda is taking place, and the global south is the place where the WPS agenda is being implemented, and where the armed conflicts are happening. And as we know, when we look at the national action plans, for example, it is also important that you don't all just implement or integrate the WPS agenda in your foreign policy, but also in your domestic policy. But that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit later, if there's some time. And another example I like to present to you is the research of Sumata Basu. And I mean, her title, the title of her paper explains it all. So she's basically saying that the global north writes 1325 too. So this is also a critique regarding the power dynamics we have in the general WPS governments, what is happening. So what are the consequences when we leave out those colonial power hierarchies in the WPS governments? One great example how we can definitely understand it is also from the work from Tony Hastrip and Jamie Hagan. They just published recently, they're looking at how national action plans, but also the WPS agenda in general, is reproducing global hierarchies, and how that reproduction of global hierarchies can be prevented. And I think it's especially interesting to see when we look at the agency within those national action plans, who's actually consulting, who's actually making the decisions, and who's also funding those national action plans. And as we all know, funding is a core issue of governing WPS agenda. So I'm looking at the time, so I'm rushing through. So maybe I just like to conclude with questions we should ask ourselves when we talk about regional governments in the Global South regarding agency and knowledge production, because otherwise we won't proceed in a gender-just peace and security policy or strategy. So two questions I like to ask are, so when we look at knowledge production, why is it that around the different forms and different spheres of feminism, the really dominant one is the Eurocentric feminism, and that's implemented then also in the policies, and other forms of feminism are even not visible or are even being erased, such as Pan-Africanism feminism, but also the feminism from the MENA region, and also womanism. So these are theories that haven't really entered the WPS academic discourse. And the other point I like to highlight is, even if concepts from those marginalized feminist theories are entering the dominant discourse in WPS agenda and therefore the governance, such as the concept of intersectionality, those concepts are not being labeled where they really come from. So intersectionality is rooted in Black feminism, for example, but it is not acknowledged in the whole discourse how intersectionality has been evolved and what kind of fights feminist actors had to handle or had to deal with to implement those concepts. So I think we really should ask ourselves those two questions. So why is knowledge production around certain feminism quite dominant, and if we have like marginalized forms of feminism being included in the dominant discourse, are they really visible and labeled as such? And to come back to the to my main question, so WPS governance in the Global South, by or for the Global South, I think it's just important, if we acknowledge knowledge production and also the agency of Global South actors, it is actually WPS governance for the whole feminist government, like on the global level. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miriam. I thought that was very, very interesting. If people have follow-up questions to Miriam, You can either reach her via LinkedIn, but we're also going to give you her Twitter handle and her email address. So you can discuss these ways with her. I think the point that really resonated with me was the whole, we believe that the feminism that we're trying to strive for is intersectional, but you are, of course, absolutely right. Where are these discourses coming from, and should we be asking a little bit more about that? I'd like to now move on to our second talk. Second talk is held by Anna-Katharina Ferl. She's also joining us from Germany. Hello, Anna. And she's a research associate and doctoral candidate at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. Her research focuses on emerging weapons technologies, mainly autonomous weapons system, and the challenges and prospects for arms control. So very much tying back into what we heard before. In her research, she wants to understand how especially military technologies and society interact and are in some cases mutually co-constitutive. One aspect of her research area encompasses the gender dimensions of new weaponized technologies, and we're going to hear a little bit about that now in her talk about why killer robots need a gender perspective. Please, Anna.
Thank you so much, and I hope you can hear me. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk, and I'm really excited to be here taking part in this amazing event. So my research focuses mainly on new weapons technologies such as lethal autonomous weapon systems and the prospects for arms control. So in my talk, I will address the issue of emerging technologies that can be used for military purposes. And one of the most prominent examples in the area is the militarization of artificial intelligence, which can lead to increased autonomy in weapon systems, such as lethal autonomous weapon systems or LAWs, or more colloquially known as killer robots. Before I come to my main arguments or the main arguments to my talk, why we need a gender perspective on killer robots, I want to start with a somewhat counterintuitive statement to shed some light on why I think it is important to think of lethal autonomous weapon systems more in gender terms, which is a perspective that's been neglected from much of the discussion so far. Since these weapon systems have not yet been developed or deployed, it is hard to predict the impact these weapon systems might have in general and more specifically on gender issues. So what if we just think for a moment that if men and women are increasingly distanced from the battlefield, having been replaced by robots or laws, the emancipation from established gender roles can actually take place? And what if these technologies enable all humankind to invest fewer resources in the conduct of war and instead make societies less militarized and more equal? This is a very interesting thought, and it sounds too good to be true. And it actually currently shows that it is far from likely that these hypothetical positive impacts will outweigh the problematic side of new weapons technologies, and especially gender. So I want to devote the next few minutes to the central questions of why we need to think about gender issues when talking about future weapons technologies. And I will try to show some insight into how laws and gender problems are interrelated and what we can do about it or how we can think about it. So first of all, there is no agreed upon international definition of what lethal autonomous weapon systems actually are, because they, or what many perceive is that they have not been developed yet as, what the concept entails. So many observers and experts understand them to be weapon systems with autonomy in their critical functions, particularly targeting decisions that the machine conducts without human control or intervention. So far, fully autonomous weapon systems remain hypothetical, but the global trend is moving rapidly in the direction of taking the human further and further out of the loop. The academic and political discussions about laws, their future impact and potentials for regulations have so far primarily focused on ethical and legal security related issues. And these are, of course, very important points, and they've been discussed for almost 10 years now. But these factors are also interrelated with gender questions, and this specifically has been neglected, especially in the political discussion or in the negotiations about possible arms control agreements. So this is why I want to focus on showing why it is paramount to analyze laws from a feminist perspective. Generally, weapons from small arms to nuclear weapons have always symbolized masculine understandings of power. And we've heard that in the opening and introductory statements. And this is true for new weapons technologies such as laws too, because they are being developed in the context of established gender essentialisms, and the use of any weapon and the use of, or the potential use of future weapons is always a gendered activity. So they perpetuate and reproduce patriarchal structures of military violence. And I just want to share a couple of thoughts with you on what these challenges look like and what the impact of new weapons technologies on gender are. But there are many, many more that I can't get into because, well, time is short and the problems are many. But if you are interested in this area, there are really interesting reports published by the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, by Reaching Critical Will and other NGOs. So one thing that I want to get into briefly, and something that we've heard before, is the problem of representation and gender balance in multilateral fora, but especially in arms control fora. Women and minority or marginalized groups are notoriously underrepresented in diplomatic and security related roles. And the same is true for arms control forums. And it is even what we heard before, even more so in these hard politics or security related areas. And I just want to give you an example. So for the first informal expert talks on laws at the Convention for Certain Conventional Weapons in Geneva in 2014, no female experts were invited. 4 years later, when formal expert or government expert meetings started, 96% of the state representatives were men and 31% were women. Even though this shows an increase, the numbers still show that equal and meaningful participation in these forums is not yet the case. And it shows a pattern that we can find in almost all multilateral arms control forums. So it represents a systemic issue. Giving women and marginalized groups their own voice and putting gender issues on the international agenda can only be the first step in achieving some change. And representation should not be an end in itself. So I will come back to that point in a little bit. But my second argument why gender is so important when we talk about lethal autonomous weapon systems, or more generally, the weaponization of artificial intelligence, is that gender bias is inherent in applications of AI. And that is already evident in software that relies on artificial intelligence algorithms, such as facial recognition software. This kind of software exhibits a bias that disproportionately misidentifies women and people of color. This has been evident in civilian use of AI and facial recognition software. And it's been documented well how women or how gender stereotypes are coded and programmed into these algorithms. And it is even worse for people of color, where facial recognition software, for instance, does not recognize people of color when they get, pictures or videos. The problem of AI bias is exacerbated when the respective software is used for targeting, profiling, and the deployment of these weapon systems. And it, of course, makes it worse when we use this, or when this bias is used to for the use of force against people. So just to wrap up real quick, what can we do about it? And this is only very, very short because the problem is, of course, very complex. But a feminist perspective on laws can help contribute to overcoming these challenges. And one thing is that arms control needs to be thought of more explicitly in feminist terms. And one part is the representation aspect, but another part needs to be revealing the inherent gender norms in armament matters and in the language and the discourse over these weapons. So in conclusion, we must challenge the way that we think and talk about these weapon systems to help overcome these unequal power distribution and the gender imbalance. And thank you very much. I hope I wasn't, okay, thanks.
Thank you, Anna. We know it is a very, very difficult task. When we came towards you and we were like, hey, can you summarize your entire PhD in 10 minutes? But I think you did a great job of it, and I thought it was very, very interesting. If anybody has follow-up questions to Anna, you can reach her via your email or her Twitter. I posted them into the chat for you guys. And yeah, thanks again to Anna and Miriam. We're now moving on to the next part of our conference. And that is going to be a quick coffee break. Usually at a real conference, the coffee break, you would usually go and grab yourself a cup of coffee and then go stand around one of those tables with a couple of people and talk, and usually meet really interesting people.